There are some words you say that you can't take back. Not because they were cruel, not because you meant to hurt anyone, just because the truth slipped out wearing the costume of a joke. And suddenly the whole room knew something you hadn't even admitted to yourself yet. I was 26 when it happened. My name is Reid, and I've told this story exactly twice in my life, once to my best friend and once to the woman I eventually married. Now I'm telling it to you because I think sometimes people need to hear that life doesn't always follow the script you write for it in your head. My best friend's name is Kevin Tran. We met in 9th grade at a high school in Guelph, Ontario, on the first day of gym class when neither of us could remember which change room was ours. We wandered the hallway for almost 10 minutes before a teacher pointed us in the right direction. By the time we got to class, everyone else was already stretching, and our gym teacher, Mr. Fallon, made us do 10 push-ups in front of the group as a consequence. We both did them badly. Kevin couldn't lock his elbows. I kept collapsing on the 3rd rep. Everyone laughed, and somehow that shared humiliation became the foundation of a friendship that lasted the next 12 years without a single serious argument. Kevin lived with his mother in a semi-detached house on a quiet street near the Speed River. His parents had separated when he was 11, and his father had moved to Calgary for work. He called sometimes, not often enough. Kevin never said much about it, but you could tell in the way he always made sure to be home for dinner, in the way he'd say, "Mom's making pho tonight," with this particular warmth in his voice. You could tell he understood what it meant to have someone show up for you because he had watched what happened when someone didn't. His mother's name was Diane Tran. She worked as a registered nurse at Guelph General Hospital, mostly evening and overnight shifts, which meant she slept until noon most days and moved through the house at odd hours with a quietness that made her feel almost like a presence rather than a person. When I visited as a teenager, I would say hi. She would smile. She'd ask how school was. I'd say fine. She'd go back to the kitchen. That was the extent of it for years. But people change. Or maybe it's more accurate to say you start to actually see them once you stop looking through the lens of whatever role they play in your life. I was 26 when I started seeing Diane Tran as a person, instead of just Kevin's mom. I had just moved back to Guelph after 2 years in Toronto, where I'd gone thinking I'd build some kind of career in graphic design and ended up freelancing for fantasy businesses who wanted logos for under $200 and always wanted revisions. I came back with a bruised ego and about $4,000 in savings, which in Guelph went further than Toronto but was still not exactly a strong start. I found a place on the East End, a 1-bedroom above a dry cleaner that smelled faintly of chemicals and had a radiator that clanked at 3 in the morning like someone was working in there. Kevin was still in St. Guelph. He'd gone to the University of Waterloo for computer science, come back, and landed a job with a tech company that let him work remotely. He still lived with Diane, which I teased him about exactly once. He told me he was saving for a place in Rockwood, and also that his mother had been alone for 15 years, and he wasn't going to leave until he knew she was okay. I stopped teasing him after that. We fell back into our old rhythm quickly. Friday nights at his place, usually, watching whatever hockey game was on, or sometimes just sitting around doing nothing in the way. That only works with people you've known long enough that silence doesn't feel like a problem to solve. Kevin would order from the Thai place on Stone Road. His mother would often be awake by then, getting ready for a night shift or winding down from one, and she'd sometimes sit with us for 20 minutes before she had to leave, or before she disappeared into her room. I started noticing things I hadn't before. The way she asked questions about whatever we were talking about and actually listened to the answers. The way she laughed at things, Kevin said, not in the polite way people laugh at their children's jokes, but genuinely like he had surprised her. The way she moved through that house with the efficiency of someone who had been managing everything alone for a long time and had made peace with it. She wasn't sad about it. That was the thing. She wasn't performing contentment either. She just seemed like someone who had decided to live her life without waiting for certain things to fall into place first. She was 49 years old. I knew this because Kevin had thrown her a small birthday dinner in September, just the 3 of us and his aunt who drove up from Hamilton. I'd brought a bottle of Ontario Pinot Noir from a winery near Niagara-on-the-Lake that the woman at the shop had recommended, and Diane had looked at the label and said she'd been meaning to try wines from that region. We'd ended up talking about it for 20 minutes, about the specific conditions that made Niagara different, about whether Canadian wine was underrated or just unevenly distributed, about a trip she'd always wanted to take along the wine route when she had enough consecutive days off to actually breathe. That was the first real conversation I'd had with her. I drove home afterward thinking about it in the vague, unexamined way you think about things that haven't yet announced themselves as important. The night everything changed happened in late October. Kevin and I had been watching this Leafs game and not enjoying it, because nobody who watches the Leafs ever fully enjoys it. You watch in a state of anxious hope that something good is about to happen and quiet resignation that it probably won't. We had food wrappers on the table, and 2 empty cans of Moosehead between us, and Kevin had started doing this thing he does when he's stressed, which is narrate the game under his breath in a flat, disappointed tone. Diane came through the front door around 9:30, still in her scrubs, her hair pulled back. She looked tired in the specific way that nurses look tired, which is different from regular tired. It's behind the eyes, a kind of hive tiredness that has nothing to do with sleep. She set her bag down by the door and said hi to both of us, and Kevin said something like, "Rue 1?" And she said, "4-hour wait and emerge tonight. What do you think?" and went toward the kitchen. Kevin made some remark about her being on call again next weekend, and she said something back that I didn't catch. And then there was this small domestic silence, the kind that happens in houses where people know each other well enough that every exchange doesn't need to land perfectly. And then, without thinking, without any actual intentions behind it except the stupid impulse to fill space with something that might get a laugh, I said it. I said that Diane was more put together than pretty much every woman I'd ever dated. I didn't say it to her, I said it to Kevin. Half joke, half mumbled, the kind of thing you say while looking at the TV screen and immediately expect to move past. But Kevin turned to look at me slowly, and in that turn I understood that I had miscalculated significantly. There was a pause, and then Diane stepped back into the doorway of the kitchen, a glass of water in her hand, and she looked at me with an expression I couldn't immediately categorize. Not offended, not amused exactly. Something more still than either of those things, like she was deciding something. She asked what I meant by that. I started to backpedal, very quickly, saying it was nothing, just a dumb comment. Pay no attention. Kevin was staring at the side of my head. I could feel it. And Diane said, and I remember this precisely because it has lived in my head ever since, she said she wasn't asking to embarrass me. She was asking because she thought it was interesting, and she didn't usually find things interesting at 10 o'clock on a Friday after 12 hours on her feet. Then she went to her room. Kevin turned back to the TV. The Leafs were losing. Neither of us said anything for a while. Finally, Kevin said, in a very quiet, measured voice, that he would really appreciate it if I never said anything like that again. I said absolutely. Totally. I was sorry. It was stupid. I didn't know why I'd said it. Which was all true. And what I didn't say out loud because I hadn't fully admitted it yet was that her response had done something to me. Not what she'd said exactly, but how she'd said it, the directness of it, the absence of drama. She hadn't gotten flustered or laughed it off or made it weird. She had just answered it like a person who knew herself well enough to engage with things honestly. I drove home that night and sat in my car in the parking lot behind my building for probably 15 minutes doing nothing, which is my version of processing something I don't have a framework for yet. I visited Kevin's place less over the next few weeks, not because we'd fought, we hadn't, but because I didn't know how to walk back into that house and act like the room had returned to its previous configuration, when I knew privately that something had shifted for me. It was the kind of feeling you want to argue yourself out of because it's inconvenient and it doesn't fit, and there are at least 3 obvious reasons why you shouldn't be feeling it. She was 23 years older than me. She was Kevin's mother. Kevin was my closest friend since I was 14 years old. Those were the 3 reasons, and I rehearsed them regularly. It didn't entirely work. About a month later, I came by to return a drill I'd borrowed from Kevin's garage, and Kevin wasn't home. He was at some kind of work thing downtown. Diane was in the backyard, raking leaves in the gray November light. She waved when she saw me through the patio door, and I went out to help without really deciding to. We raked leaves for about 40 minutes. At some point, she made tea and we stood on the back step with our mugs, and she asked about my work, and I told her honestly that it was going okay, but that I wasn't sure it was what I wanted to be doing for the next 20 years. She didn't offer advice. She asked another question. She asked what I thought I would do if money weren't a constraint, and I gave her the half-joking answer I usually gave. and she waited like she expected the real answer after that, so I gave her that one too. I told her I thought I wanted to do something with environmental design, working on public spaces, parks, signage systems, the way cities communicate with people without words. I'd never said it out loud to anyone before, because it felt impractical and a little grandiose. She listened to the whole thing, and then said that it didn't sound impractical to her. It sounded like someone who had noticed something about the world that other people hadn't bothered to articulate. I didn't know what to do with that. We talked until Kevin got home, which was another hour and a half. When Kevin came through the back gate and saw us standing there, his expression did something complicated that he smoothed over quickly. He said, "Hey." We said, "Hey." We went inside. Nothing happened. Nothing was said. But the thing that had been sitting quietly in the corner of that house for weeks had gotten a little harder to pretend wasn't there. Over the next month, Diane and I talked a handful more times. Not secretly, not arranged. It was just that Kevin's house had become a place I went regularly, and Diane was there, and we had, apparently, found a frequency on which we could talk easily. Once it was a long conversation about the healthcare system and whether nurses were being asked to carry too much of what was actually a staffing and funding problem. Once it was about her childhood in Peterborough, her own parents, what it had been like to grow up with a father who worked 3 jobs and still managed to coach minor hockey on Sunday mornings. Once it was very short, just a few minutes while she was leaving for a shift, about a novel I'd mentioned and whether she'd read it, and she hadn't. But she took down the title, and 2 weeks later, she brought it up again with actual opinions about it. I was paying attention in a way that I hadn't paid attention to anyone in a long time. That was the thing I couldn't argue myself out of. One evening in late January, I was at the house, and Kevin had gone to bed early because he has a 7 o'clock call the next morning. Diane and I were in the kitchen, and she was making a pot of her mother's congee, which she said she made whenever she needed to feel grounded. And she asked if I wanted to stay for a bowl. I said yes. We sat at the kitchen table for almost 2 hours. At some point, the conversation slowed, and she looked at me in the way she sometimes did, directly, without the social filler people usually use to soften direct looks. And she said that she wanted to say something, and she hoped I'd take it the way it was meant. She said she noticed that she came around a lot. She said she noticed our conversations. She said she wasn't 26, and she wasn't going to pretend that things between us had the ordinary shape of things, but that she also wasn't going to pretend she hadn't thought about it. She said that if I had thought about it too, she thought I should be honest with myself about that, because she had learned, the hard way and more than once, that being dishonest with yourself about what you wanted was how you ended up living a life that belonged to someone else's idea of you. Then she got up and washed her bowl and said goodnight, and I sat at Kevin's kitchen table for a while by myself. I barely slept that night. I kept thinking about Kevin, about what it would mean, about the friendship, about the particular kind of trust involved in someone letting you into their home for 12 years. I thought about my own history of backing away from things that scared me, the job I'd left because it had seemed too risky to stay, the relationship I'd ended because commitment had felt like a wall instead of a door. I thought about how I tended to make decisions from the outside in, based on how things looked rather than from the inside out, based on what was actually true. And I thought about what Diane had said, about being honest with yourself, about the lives people end up living when they're not. I asked Kevin if we could get coffee. We went to a place on Wyndham Street that we'd been going to since university, a small independent roastery that always had a line on Saturday mornings. We sat in the window and I waited until we were through most of our cups before what I needed to say. I told him that something had happened that I hadn't planned and hadn't been looking for. I told him I valued our friendship more than I knew how to properly communicate, and that nothing about what I was about to say was more important than that. And then I told him the truth. Kevin set his cup down. He looked out the window at Wyndham Street for a long time. There was a guy outside trying to parallel park a pickup truck, and he kept at it unsuccessfully for 3 full attempts, while Kevin said nothing. Then Kevin looked back at me and said, "She's my mom, Jordan," he said. "She's been through enough. If you're not serious about this, then don't." I said I understood. He said he needed some time, and I said of course, and we left the coffee shop without saying much else. That was the start about 4 months where things between Kevin and me were reduced to sparse, careful text messages. He never cut me off entirely, but the ease was gone, replaced by a politeness that was almost worse than silence because it kept reminding me what I'd put at risk. Diane and I didn't see each other during that time either. She had her own version of the same conversation with Kevin, which she told me about later. She'd raised him alone for 18 years. She knew his fears. She also knew her own. What surprised me, and what I think surprised Kevin too, was that the time away did something he hadn't expected. He started to notice, he told me later, how much of his mother's life he had maybe taken for granted. Not in an ungrateful way. Kevin was not an ungrateful person, but in the way you can be present in someone's life and still not fully see them. He started noticing that she came home from shifts that would flatten most people and made dinner without being asked. That she read until midnight because she had trouble winding down after work and there was no one to talk to. That she was alive in ways that had nothing to do with her role as his mother, and that she had been setting those parts of herself aside, quietly, for a very long time. He called me in March. We met at the same coffee shop. He was quiet for most of the first cup. Then he said something I have not forgotten. He said, "She deserves somebody who shows up." He said it flatly, like a fact, not like an endorsement. He said if I hurt her, we were done. He said it without drama, which made it feel more serious than any dramatic version would have. And then he said that maybe life was more complicated than the tidy version he'd had in his head, and he was going to have to figure out how to live in the more complicated version. It was the most honest thing he'd ever said to me. Diane and I went on our first actual date in April, when the ice had finally given up, and everything in Guelph had that particular early spring smell of cold earth and something tentative starting. We drove out to a small restaurant in Alora. Not fancy, just a place along the Grand River with good food and candles on the tables and the kind of quiet where you can actually hear each other. We sat for 3 hours and talked about everything. Her nursing career, how she'd considered leaving it twice and twice decided she couldn't, not because she couldn't imagine doing something else, but because she couldn't imagine not being useful to people in a physical, present way. My childhood, which was quieter and more ordinary than hers. The river, visible through the window, going dark as the evening went on. What we were both afraid of, what we'd stopped being afraid of, it felt like the most honest conversation I'd been part of in years. There were complicated moments afterward, as there always are when a life rearranges itself. The first Christmas was awkward in ways that required everyone to try a little harder than usual. Kevin's aunt from Hamilton made a comment at dinner that nobody directly acknowledged and then moved past. There were evenings when the three of us were in the same room and it took a few minutes for the old ease to come back, like a language you used to speak fluently that your mouth has to remember. But it did come back, gradually, and then more steadily. The way rivers move, they're always going, even when they look still. 2 years after the night I said something thoughtless in Kevin's living room, Diane and I got engaged. Kevin was the first person I called. He was quiet for a second and then he said, "I know," in the tone of someone who had made his peace with a thing before the thing officially arrived. He was my best man. I want to be honest about something because I think honesty is the only version of this story worth telling. There was nothing magical or fated about any of it. I said something stupid. A woman responded to it with more directness than I was used to. I paid attention when I could have looked away. She was willing to be honest about what she wanted when most people her age, most people any age, had learned to manage their expectations downward. Kevin found a way to be bigger than his instinct to protect, because he loved his mother more than he needed things to be uncomplicated. None of that was fate. It was just people choosing badly at first and then better, to be honest. Diane is 53 now, I'm 30. She still works nights at Guelph General, though fewer of them since the hospital restructured the scheduling last year. I work for a design consultancy in Guelph that does urban planning and public space projects, which is not the exact thing I described on Kevin's backstep that November, but it is close enough that I recognize it. Kevin and I still watch the Leafs together. We still talk about everything. He still lives in Guelph, in the house in Rockwood he finally bought. He's with someone now, a woman named Alicia who teaches elementary school and who he met at a trivia night at a pub on Gordon Street that I dragged him to when I thought he needed to get out of the house. He's different in the way that people are different when they're with someone who is genuinely good for them. Last fall, the three of us, Kevin, Diane, and I, went for dinner at a place downtown. Just the three of us, the way we do every few months. At some point, Kevin said with the completely deadpan expression he uses for things that are actually funny to him, You know, I've told this story exactly once at a work happy hour and nobody believed any of it. Diane said, "Good, it's ours." He lifted his glass. We all did. And then we talked about other things, about Alicia's classroom, about a project I was working on near Exhibition Park, about whether Guelph's downtown was finally going to get the redesign it had needed for a decade. And the story folded back into the ordinary fabric of our lives, where all the most important stories eventually go. Some things start with the most embarrassing sentence you've ever said out loud. Some friendships survive things they were never supposed to survive, and sometimes the person who changes your life most completely is someone you spent years seeing without actually looking. I looked up one October evening in a house I'd been going to for over a decade and finally saw her. That was all it took.